Hello and welcome back to SIG Mechanics. I'm Edmund. Today I want to do a quick video that's a bit of a primer on trigger mechanics. Now, people generally have a good grasp on trigger mechanics as an overall concept. However, people also have varying opinions on the terms commonly used to define a particular trigger stage. And this is mainly due to the fact that there is minutiae to the slight transitions that occur during a trigger pull. So here, I'm going to explain and demonstrate all the steps involved in trigger pull mechanics. I'm going to clarify what is pre-travel, break, and reset, but also what are the subcategories to these steps, things like take up, wall, and creep. I will also be outlining when it is that a user transitions from one of these steps into the next during a trigger pull. And in SIG Mechanics fashion, I will be providing full explanations as well as visual cues to help give a complete understanding of these steps by the end of the video. And just a note, the mechanics discussed in this video apply to pistols in general. Say like the 1911, which is a hammer-fired pistol, will go through all the same stages as this P320, which is a striker-fired pistol. But the P320 will allow me to do two things. First, explore trigger mechanics unobstructed by a full frame encasing the inner parts. And second, to use this, a fully modeled 3D render of the real thing, which will allow me to break the laws of physics just enough to showcase the fine details of the mechanics going on. Let's begin. Let's start with a core definition that should be clarified before getting into the intricacies of a trigger pull. We begin by defining trigger travel, which is simply because trigger travel is the overall movement of the trigger, and every single step of a trigger pull will happen within this definition. So, trigger travel is the overall distance that a trigger will travel from full rest, meaning no contact with the trigger at all, to completely pulled, where the trigger is back and can't physically move back further. Within the definition of trigger travel, an operator will go through and experience all the various phases of a trigger pull, starting with trigger pre-travel. Now, trigger pre-travel is defined as any measurable distance that the trigger moves from the point in which the trigger is engaged to just before the gun fires. But it's worth mentioning up front that similar to trigger travel itself, trigger pre-travel actually includes within its definition a few subphases, and these subphases are take up, wall, and creep, all the way up to, but not including the break. So let's define these subphases. Take up is any trigger movement towards the back of the pistol up until you hit the wall, which I will explain in a moment, and refers to any movement of the trigger that does not cause the sear to actually move. For example, here is a stock P320, and this is the sear. And when I pull the trigger, you can see the sear moves down. However, if I place the trigger to full rest and then lightly move the trigger, there is no movement to the sear, and that's because the trigger assembly has yet to engage it. And this is what take-up is. Let's take a closer look. If we remove the FCU's chassis from the pistol and exposed the fire control group within the sear housing, we can see the trigger bar and how the trigger bar engages with the sear as the operator pulls the trigger. So, the take-up on this setup will be the distance between the trigger bar at full rest up until the point of contact with the sear itself. During this time, an operator might feel a slight resistance of the trigger bar spring, but not much weight other than that. And once you've made contact with the sear, you transition to the next phase, the wall. The definition of the wall can be more nuanced than people think, and I believe this has to do with the terminology of it being called the wall, and that inspires the image of something being extremely difficult to move. And that's likely why sometimes people only count the wall from the point in which they feel the most amount of resistance on the trigger just before the gun fires. But the wall, in its true definition, is actually more of a point in time during a trigger pull, that the trigger bar engages the sear, but does not actually move it yet. Instead, it would refer to the immediate increase of weight that a user would need to add to the trigger from that point forward to begin the act of moving the sear. At this point, the user will now need to increase trigger pull weight exponentially during the length of the trigger pull. Now, this begins the next phase called creep. Trigger creep is any distance traveled by the trigger that moves the sear and compresses the sear springs all the way up to the brake. And if you pay attention and move slowly, you can begin to feel this tension stacking up as you pull the trigger. You might even feel the trigger make microscopic jumps or jerks, or maybe have a gritty texture just before the striker or hammer releases. Creep is defined by that movement where you pull the trigger and you're met with increased resistance, which causes you to pull the trigger harder, which causes increased resistance, in which case you again creep the trigger back with the intention of keeping true aim by the time your gun fires, which may cause you to tense up your hand and begin to shake moderately until the striker or hammer is actually released. Now, at some point during the creep phase, the hammer or striker is so close to releasing and the trigger will overcome the last bit of sear spring resistance and the gun will fire. Here is what we know as the brake. Now, the definition of brake is not a measure of distance when talking about trigger travel, but a point in time in which the act occurs. It's very difficult to draw a line in which one transitions from the edge of creep to brake because it's a relative blur. Now, there's not much to be added or explained about this step, so let's just move on. After the brake, there's a point in which the trigger will have at least some degree of overtravel. Overtravel is defined by a distance that the trigger travels immediately after the brake occurs. It's essentially the cushion space, or in some well-tuned pistols, a microscopic gap that the trigger must travel for two reasons. If the trigger stopped literally at the edge of brake, the action would likely result in the gun not firing. There needs to be some degree of spacing for the trigger to push itself over the edge and overcome the brake to release the hammer or striker. And also, overtravel is a huge factor in the crispiness of a trigger. If you had next to zero overtravel and pulled the trigger, the fact that you would lack any tactile trigger movement after the gun fires would make the trigger feel somehow defective. Now, to complete the process of trigger overtravel, you have to have a start point, which we just explained, and a stop point, which is likely going to be a physical barrier that once the trigger touches will stop the trigger from traveling back any further. This is known as the trigger stop. And it comes in many various forms, but the P320 has a pin here, and this is where the trigger rests at full stop. At this point, now the gun's been fired, and if the operator is holding the trigger firmly onto the stop pin and releases the trigger, he starts the last phase of trigger travel, reset. The definition of trigger reset would be the action that the trigger assembly must make to reposition itself for the next shot. And this action would differ depending on the firearm, but most certainly would mean that the sear and the trigger bar need to realign or reset themselves to their original position. The reset will also have a tactile feel, as its function is caused by the releasing of your finger from the trigger, thus releasing the tension on the internal springs that will then cause the trigger bar to drop back behind the sear, at which point you hear your audible click and you're ready to pull the trigger again. So a quick and final recap. Trigger travel is the full motion that a trigger does from full rest to completely pulled. Trigger pre-travel is the engagement of the trigger to just before the gun fires and includes within it take-up, wall, and creep. Take-up is the distance from full rest to the wall. Wall is the point in time in which your trigger bar touches the sear but does not actually move it. Creep is when your trigger bar actually moves the sear all the way to just before the gun fires. The brake is the moment in time in which the striker or hammer is released and the gun fires. Overtravel is any distance that the trigger moves back immediately after the brake until it hits a physical stop point. And reset is the act of releasing the trigger to allow the internal springs to realign the trigger bar and sear for it to fire again. I know this video is a bit different from what I've done in the past, but it came to be as I was working on testing some triggers for another project, and then I realized that I never saw any videos like this when I started out that clearly defined trigger terms. So I figured this is a great way to help others, especially those that are maybe newer in the firearms community. so that they have a better, more complete understanding of how to talk about their guns and be able to confidently communicate to others maybe any problems or experiences that they're having, especially to those that maybe have been around a little longer. Anyways, thank you for watching this video. I hope you learned something new. Don't forget to subscribe to keep up with all the new videos coming up. And lastly, a quick thank you to SIG Mechanics partner, MD Charlton, who is the one and only warranty partner certified with Sig Sauer USA north of the border. Anyways, that's it for today. See you soon.